So quickly, to summarize last week, we talked about a number of herbal traditions around the world, discussed the use of herbs by Neanderthals dating back tens of thousands of years ago. We talked about how different cultures have different operating systems, how they view health and herbs. And as I sort of mentioned before, some things that may sound a little bit ridiculous when you have a better medical scientific understanding of health does not mean that their system of diagnosis and treatment of patients doesn't work. I mean, the actual outcome, the most important thing is, do people get better after you diagnose and treat them? So when we're talking about things like wind heat invasions or deficiencies or excess of chi or describe the imbalances in the doshas, it's may not sound like it should work, but those healing systems all work to varying degrees. And even conventional medicine, uh, as scientific and high tech as it is, it doesn't always work. It's an operating system based on reductionism that often works for some things, but can also cause problems in other areas. So that's a quick little background. Now, when we're moving on, we're going to go to kind of the roots of Western herbalism. So when we talk about Ayurvedic medicine and TCM, Kempo, a lot of those herbal traditions have now, some of their herbs have been adopted into Western herbalism. But really, when it comes to Western herbalism, I would say that our roots sort of go back to the ancient Egyptians. And that's one of the first really big civilizations in the West, dating back 3,000 years ago. And it's interesting to think that ancient Egypt, that we are actually closer to the ancient Romans than the ancient Romans were to the ancient Egyptian civilization dating back 3000 BC. Like, that just kind of blows my mind how long some of these civilizations have been around for. And the ancient Egyptians were really good at documenting things, even though they didn't use language that we use today. A lot of the information was dated down. And one of probably the first contributors to it was Inhotep, who is considered to be the world's first physician, or at least not the world's, maybe the Western world's first physician. And he was responsible for writing a series of scrolls called the Edwin Smith Papyrus. And so Edwin Smith was the archaeologist who discovered it. And in these writings that were written on papyrus paper, they describe anatomy and various conditions. And another important text was called the Ebers Papyrus. And this is a famous medical text that included hundreds of different plants and various remedies to help with healing. And what's really, to give you a couple of examples, one of the things that the ancient Egyptians used to do is take ephedra, which I'm showing on the left there. And ephedra contains the compound called ephedrine. You've probably heard of ephedrine. It's often used in cold and sinus medications as a decongestant. But the way that it works is it acts as a sympathomimetic, and what that means is it mimics the sympathetic nervous system and triggers the fight or flight response. And the benefit for that in your sinuses is it causes vasoconstriction, opens up the bronchioles, helps with respiration. But as a side effect, it can also elevate blood pressure and can lead to weight loss, which is one of the reasons why ephedrine or ephedra was used irresponsibly in some weight loss products and was banned by the FDA for that purpose, and Health Canada as well. And so the ancient Egyptians knew that ephedra, the herb, could be used as a bronchodilator to help people with asthma because of the side effects. One of the things that they would do is take the plant and crush it between two hot rocks and then inhale the vapors. And so that way you'd be able to get the benefits of the ephedra localized to the lungs and minimize the side effects with the high blood pressure and increased heart rate and some of the other undesirable side effects. And so that's kind of one of the world's first puffers for asthma. And just by the route of administration of it, how they delivered it, they realized they could have more of a therapeutic effect and less side effects, which is just kind of cool, I think. Oops, I'm not even in my keynote. There we go. So there's ancient Egypt. You guys know about that. There is, I think, Eber's papyrus all written down on papyrus paper. Now, moving on from there, we have Greco-Roman medicine. And so Greco-Roman medicine really is a continuation of the ancient Egyptian medicine, and they had their own, it sort of evolved from that, but integrated a lot of other things. And so as you probably know, the ancient Greeks was kind of the next civilization to come along, and there was a number of important contributors, and classic Greek was around 300 to 500 BC, and then the Roman Empire overlapped with that and went to about 580. So the Roman Empire basically expanded to include not just Italy, but also Greece and parts of the Middle East, and went all the way up into Northern Europe, like into England and into North Africa. So it kind of had a huge area that it covered. And so a lot of the medical contributors were Greek and Roman, and they also obtained knowledge of medicine and herbal medicine from other places in Europe and the Middle East. So Hippocrates is considered the father of modern medicine, and he's seen this. He's recognized by both conventional medicine and herbalists and naturopaths. And so he was a Greek physician who developed a code of medical ethics. He's one of the guys who said, "First, do no harm." I'm sure you've heard of that. And like a lot of the other systems like TCM, he recognized that illnesses basically resulted from natural causes as opposed to supernatural, like spirits and things like that. So a lot of the advice he gave was pretty logical stuff. You need to be healthy and eat and be active, and a lot of other good health tips. And one of the systems that they used, or one of the ways that they used to diagnose patients with concerns, was based on what are called the four humors. And so it was believed that the body contained these four humors: phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and blood. And that any kind of excess or deficiencies in these four humors would result in illness. And so if you had an excess of a particular humor, then herbs would be given to build that up, or if you had to sort of relieve that, and if you had a deficiency in something, then you'd take something to help to build it up. And so this is similar to what you see in the idea of these other holistic traditions in Eastern traditions, like in Ayurvedic and Chinese medicine, where things were based on excesses and deficiencies of something in the body, whether it's the 5 elements or the 3 doshas or whatever it may be. It's that holistic model of excess, deficiency, stagnation, and these various things. And so there are a number of different terms that sort of evolved from the system of medicine that you've probably heard of, like melancholy. When people are depressed, it's due to issues with the humors. Dyscrasia basically is an imbalance where there's kind of toxic buildup in the body, dirty blood leading to disease states. And so some of the early herbal books use terms like this that aren't really incorporated in conventional medicine anymore, but you'll still see it in herbal book, in some herbal books. They'll talk about, for example, alterative herbs are used to clean the blood to help resolve dyscrasia in the body, and that's sort of where these things are coming from. Now, beyond Hippocrates, another guy was called Dioscorides, and he was an important Greek physician, and he basically was traveling around with the Roman army, going to various places and helping to heal members of the army. And while doing that, he would interview and meet with various local herbalists or people involved with medicine around the areas that he traveled, and he would document the various plants that had medicinal properties along the way. And this is a really important text that I would say that the things that we learn about now has been built on this, and this is kind of neat. So the book that I wrote was called Materia Medica, and it lists hundreds of plants that have various indications, and so some of his writings would have been based on the Egyptian herbs and traditions, and then sort of evolved, and it probably included some from England and some from the Middle East as well. Now, moving on, a few hundred or 100 years after that is an individual called Galen. And Galen was building on the teachings of Hippocrates and the other early doctors, and he started making crude extracts of herbs that would be kind of drugs. Because appreciate when you start off with a plant, when you have something like chamomile, you basically have the whole herb that you could eat just in the state that it is, just chew on the flowers. Or you can do a simple extraction using water, and water, herbal extraction would be like tea, it's just adding water to it so that you're helping to extract most of the water-soluble components, but also some of the essential oils. Or you could use an alcohol or an oil to extract different types of compounds. So if you're using oil, you're going to get more of the fat-soluble components. And then you can also, in labs now, you can extract something from chamomile, like a bioflavonoid called apigenin, if you wanted to, and have 100% pure apigenin. And at that point, I would say if you're giving pure apigenin or pure quercetin or pure whatever it may be, it's become more like a drug in the sense that it's an isolated individual component where you no longer have the synergy of the whole plant. So chamomile will have in it bioflavonoids, some essential oils, sesquiterpenes, some vitamins and minerals as well. But if you continue to do refining and extractions, you just end up with one thing. And that might be a good thing, or it could be giving someone pure apigenin, the bioflavonoid, would have some indications. But just appreciate that the extracted single compound will behave differently than the whole plant. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it comes with some other disadvantages, okay? And the term drug means druga. That actually comes, I think it's a German term, which means plant. And so the earliest drugs were derived from plants. And so Galen was an individual who started doing some more extraction. He sort of further developed this concept of the humoral theory and documented that down. And that became sort of the dominant perspective or approach to Western medicine for about 1,500 years. And the reason for that was the Roman Empire collapsed around 400 AD or so, and 500 AD it started to collapse. And so the issue with that is when the Roman Empire collapsed, you had places like Northern Europe, which no longer had the protection of the Roman Empire, so barbarians started attacking. So individual little landowners would build castles, try to protect them and the people around them from these wandering barbarians that kept invading them. And so you'd have these little pockets where people were kind of, there's nothing unifying Europe, nothing unifying England. It was just a whole bunch of people trying to looking out for themselves. And so there wasn't the platform, just didn't really exist for people to come together and debate and further a lot of these medical traditions. And that's why things went into the Dark Ages in Europe, because of the collapse of the Roman Empire. So Galen's and the people before him, their concepts really were sort of unchanged for over 1,000 years. And appreciate in the rest of the world, like in China and even in the Middle East, things were continuing to evolve, and people were learning more and more and changing their ways of practicing. So there's a picture of Hippocrates there. This is one of the diagrams that refers to the humoral theory, where you've got hot and cold, wet and dry, and these things lead to, depending on whether things are dry or hot or wet or cold, can affect the various humors. There's Dioscorides, an important doctor who wrote down all the herbal texts, and then Galen, who refined the humoral theory. Now, another system of medicine that still exists today is called Unani medicine. And this is the traditional Arabic medicine, and it's still practiced around the world. I remember when I was in Malaysia, there's practitioners there. Malaysia is still primarily Muslim, and so you also will find it in parts of Indonesia. You'll find it in India, obviously the Middle East, and other parts of South Asia. And this system of medicine evolved from Greco-Roman medicine because the Roman Empire was in these areas, and or at least in the Middle East. And when it collapsed, it's still, those medical traditions were there, and it evolved. I mean, it took on some new language as well, because most of this is written in Arabic as opposed to Roman or Greek or Italian or whatever it's written in where the Roman Empire was. And because of the proximity to South Asia and the Far East, and because of trade, it would have incorporated a few more of the herbs that were in those regions that would grow in the Middle East as well. And some of the main contributors in this, one individual in particular is called Avicenna, and he's considered to be a prince of physicians. He was both a pharmacist and a physician, and he basically created the system of medicine called Unani medicine, and he wrote an important text called the Canon of Medicine that basically had a standardized approach to medicine, and it had hundreds of plants in there. And he basically was one of the big authoritative figures in pharmacy. And interestingly enough, even though Greco-Roman medicine basically inspired and was the foundation of the Unani medicine, a lot of what was going on in the Middle East was then later on reintroduced back into Europe and influenced European medicine later on. And as I mentioned, it's still practiced around the world in lots of different places. So there are herbs. This is one called black cumin. That's highly revered in the Middle East. It has a lot of antimicrobial properties. It's an interesting compound. They make essential oils out of it called, so the black seed is another name for it. You can buy the essential oil in various places, or it's not the essential oil. Say that's like the cold pressed oil from the seeds that has compounds that kind of remind me of oregano oil when you look at the structure of them, as well as some fixed oils like you would have in other seeds like flax and things like that. And so it's been researched for various respiratory conditions, for inflammatory conditions, and also for cancer. Herbs like frankincense and myrrh are also, these were included in the Greco-Roman medicine as well, but these tend to grow in the Middle East where this system of medicine is practiced. Now we're going to move back into Europe. So as I mentioned, when the Roman Empire collapsed in about 500 AD, there wasn't a whole lot going on in Europe and with regards to what was being documented, because it went in the Dark Ages. There weren't universities formed yet. People they were just trying to protect themselves. And so there wasn't great communication going on. And so medicine became sort of under the responsibility of the churches. And so monastic medicine went from about 500 to about 1300 AD. And so in a lot of the monasteries, they would have herb gardens, and monks would be responsible for helping people with their health. And eventually, around 10th century, the Arabic influences started coming back into Europe. But in addition to that, I think one thing that doesn't always get a lot of credit is traditional folk medicine. And I appreciate in, for example, England, we had the Druids, and other areas of Europe had different herbalists and folk traditions, and the indigenous people in Europe had their own ways of doing things. This may not have been documented as well as you might have seen during Greco-Roman times or compared to like traditional Chinese medicine, but they did have systems of medicine where you go to the local herbalist and they could help you. Later on, a lot of these people that are knowledgeable in herbal medicine were maybe considered witches, and that's probably because the Roman Church didn't like them for various reasons, including because they Roman Catholic Church, because they were helping women with abortions and some other things. But there's a lot of neat history there. So the folk medicine and their contributions to Western herbalism isn't really clear, just like the indigenous people in North America. They don't always get the credit they deserve. Now, pharmacy was established in about the 12th century in Europe. That's about 400 years after it was established in the Middle East and Persia. One important individuals who started to shape medicine up in Europe was an individual called Paracelsus, and he's considered to be the father of modern pharmacy. And back then, pharmacists pharmacy was kind of overlapping with mysticism. So he was a physician. He was also an alchemist. If you know anything about alchemy, one of the things they were trying to do is turn lead into gold. They were looking at creating elixirs of youth and all these other things that they're doing. And they're also big into astrology and the occult. So they're far more interesting than probably modern pharmacists are. And one of the things that Paracelsus did was he was a very outspoken individual. And he basically challenged the old system, the Greco-Roman system that Galen had developed, and he would get himself into trouble. He'd go and start burning books in the street that talked about Galen's books, and kind of revolting against that to move forward. And he used a lot of chemistry to do a lot of extractions. He used herbs, but he also would do it on metals. So shortly after this, people started using more heavy metals in medicine. And one of the things that Paracelsus talked about was the concept that everything, or his big quote was that all things are poison. Nothing is without poison. The dose alone causes things not to be poison. And this is an important concept. I'm going to skip to it if I can. So there's Paracelsus there. Another guy, Culpeper, will come back to him in a second. To come back to that picture in a second. Oops, that's what I was looking for. So what he's basically, Paracelsus, what he's talking, when he's talking about all things are poison, and we're talking about the dose in terms of whether it's poisonous or not, this is an important thing that applies to everything that we do. And so the idea behind this is that too little of something could be bad for you. I mean, I don't think too little wine is bad for you, but that certainly applies. This curve can shift over to the left and the right depending on what you're talking about. But in the case of wine, if you have a little bit of wine, it might be better for you than having no wine. But if you have too much wine, it's not good for you, right? And so 1 glass of wine or 2 glasses of wine is good for you. 10 glasses of wine is bad for you. And this applies if you're talking about antioxidants. So we know that antioxidants from a dietary source have a lot of health benefits. Things like carotenoids, vitamin E, they're all good. But a lot of the studies show that when you give vitamin E in supplement form, um, it doesn't appear to help you. And if you take too much of it, it actually makes you die sooner. Okay. And so this is probably a good graph that depicts moderation, everything in moderation. Too much exercise is bad as well. Too much oxygen, too much sunlight. I mean, I think a little bit of sunlight is good for you. Too much is bad for you. And sometimes people think that everything that's good for you is linear. You know, if a little is good, lots is even better. Or if something's bad for you, then you should take none of it. And I don't always think that's the case. So the challenge is figuring out what the ideal amount of these things are. And the reason why I'm bringing this up as well is appreciate when we're talking about herbs, a herb, let's say a herbal tea like chamomile, there you might be able to have 10 cups a day of chamomile, and it's, you know, chamomile tea is really, really safe because you're never going to get too much of the active ingredients. And because it's relatively safe and you're taking relatively small amounts, it's not an issue. But if you were to suddenly take some compound out of chamomile, super concentrated like the essential oil, and then drink 500 mils of the essential oil from chamomile, it would be toxic. Or inject it, it would be even more toxic. So just appreciate things that are natural are often safe, but even safe things become unsafe at some point. Okay. So going back to the other slide, so that's an important little concept that was developed. And so take on with Paracelsus, he shook things up. He rejected a lot of the early humoral theories of medicine, and he started sort of became the father of modern pharmacy and came up with that idea that, you know, even toxic things can be safe if you get the right dose. Now, for me, I'm not sure whether or not any dose of mercury has health benefits, but perhaps it does. I mean, maybe it does for treating some kind of infections if you don't have any other treatments around, but I prefer not to use heavy metals in practice. But appreciate, you know, as ridiculous as it sounds, we know that in Western medicine we used antimony and a number of other mercury and other heavy metals for a period of time because there wasn't any other effective treatments available. And they're still used in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine in some formulas, which I don't particularly think is a wise idea. So, so even though I like TCM, I don't like the fact that they use rhino horns and heavy metals. One, for ethical reasons, and two, because it may not be safe, right? So just because I like natural medicines and herbal medicine and these traditional traditions doesn't mean I like everything in it, okay? Now, another important guy was called Nicholas Culpeper, and he's wrote in a really important book called Complete Herbal. And the reason why this book was so significant is that up to this point in time, medicine was under the control of the elite. Like doctors, you had to go to your doctor and pay money in order to feel better. And a lot of people couldn't afford that. It was just inaccessible for a lot of people. So Nicholas Culpeper was able to, because he was a doctor and a herbalist, he was able to write this stuff down for the layperson, and it became a really important text. And it was the most important non-religious. So I mean, it can't really compete with the Bible, but for the time, it was a really, really important book. And when you read Culpeper's book, a lot of the knowledge is based on the Greco-Roman stuff. And what's interesting is because people were big into astrology at the time, some of the herbs were described as having some affinity with the planets. So maybe this herb is ruled by Mars, or it's particularly good for people with, you know, Scorpio-like tendencies or whatever it is. And I don't really know a lot about how it's described. And so even though astrology, I would say most scientific people don't put a lot of weight into anything that comes out of astrology. it still is an operating system. So let's say the stars and the planets don't have any influence on our lives, but that operating system of understanding how Mars is associated with a certain organ in the body, and that taking this herb can help someone who's suffering from something related to that organ. It's an operating system. So as ridiculous as it sounds, it could still be useful for identifying what someone has and coming up with a treatment protocol. Okay. The reason why I include, I love to travel, and for years before I had kids, I would travel everywhere and photograph herbs wherever I went. It's a great way to have to write off your trips. So here's a place in Italy, which is in Padua, which is just outside of Venice in the north, and it's a really cool place. If you're ever in northern Italy and you want to do a little day trip to a herb garden, it basically has specimens from all around the world, and it's a teaching university, a medical university. And when it was originally set up, it was used as a place where people could come and look at the plants and learn about them. And it's still in operation now. So I don't recommend going in August because everything's kind of dry and dead at that point. But it's a really cool place. Take a few photos, write it off as a business trip. It's a good way to do it. So chamomile is an awesome herb. I was talking about it earlier. You can find this at every single grocery store and probably tea shop in the world. I mean, it's very, very common. And it's gentle, but it has a lot of great medicinal properties. It's used for stomach aches. It can be used for a colicky baby if they're being fussy. Has some mild sedative properties, so it can help with anxiety or help people fall asleep or just calm them down if they've had a bad day. It's great. And this is German chamomile. It grows around the world. I know it's in Europe. I know it's in North Africa. I know it's in Eastern Europe. So it probably grows in a lot of different places. It was introduced as well. Another important herb, horse chestnut, which is used for varicose veins and some other circulatory issues. I showed you that. Now moving over to American herbalism. So most of American herbalism is rooted in the European tradition, but then it's also being fused with a lot of knowledge that was acquired from First Nations people. And so North American Indians, they have their own herbs that are unique to them. Some of the herbs overlap with herbs from Europe just because they tend to grow wild all around the world. But some of them are very unique to it. And so when early settlers came over, certain individuals learned about the herbs and were able to document it. One individual was called Samuel Thompson, and he was considered to be the father of American herbalism. And he, unlike a lot of the other people we talked about, he was not a doctor. He wasn't a pharmacist. Didn't really have any formal training in medicine or herbalism. But he became interested in herbal medicine because at the time, conventional medicine around 1800s, they were doing some pretty invasive treatments. If you're sick, they do a lot of bloodletting. So they literally drain blood out of you trying to get rid of the offending agent, or they give you mercury or antimony or some of these other heavy metals that were really, really toxic. And so the concern was if you go to the doctor, you might end up dying from the actual treatment itself rather than from the disease. So, and I think George Washington he died because he was basically, they did bloodletting on him. So it was kind of a scary time for patients. And so after he or some family members almost died from seeing the doctor, he went searching for other ways to help people or to help learn about health. And through interacting with First Nations people, he basically learned about a bunch of herbs. And then he started to exploit their knowledge and made a whole bunch of patents, herbal patents that he made a bunch of money off of. And he's a very successful businessman. And so probably he did some, self-serving things with the knowledge, but he also was able to document a lot of this and incorporate some of the herbs from First Nations people into Western herbalism. And so some of the things that he was using, there's one of the books that Samuel Thompson wrote. Some of the herbs that are used in North American herbal tradition is this herb here, which is Lobelia inflata, which the common name is Indian tobacco or pukeweed. And the reason why they call it pukeweed is because if you drink it, it'll make you vomit. But in small amounts, it actually acts as an expectorant. So a little bit what it does is it actually helps to increase mucus production, like a thin, watery mucus that'll help you to cough up or to expectorate phlegm that's stuck in the chest. So presumably one of the reasons why it does this is because when you stimulate the vomiting center in the brain, one of the things that the body does to protect itself from all the acid that's about to come up the esophagus is to make more mucus that's nice and viscous to protect the mucous membranes. But it's not exclusively produced in the respiratory tract, or in the gastrointestinal tract. It's also produced in the respiratory tract as well. And so a small amount of pukeweed or lobelia or Indian tobacco, whatever you want to call it, will increase the mucus production. Just like if you've ever, I'm sure everyone's vomited before, and you know that feeling when you start swallowing, you start feeling there's a little bit more fluids are being excreted, and that's your body's making more saliva and mucus to try to protect your esophagus. So a little bit will produce that mucus to help expectorate phlegm, and then if you take too much, it'll cause vomiting. At the time, they were using things like mercury, which caused people to basically have vomiting, diarrhea, and would purge them out. And they thought that was a good thing. And pukeweed was often given with other herbs like cayenne to stimulate circulation or to get them to vomit out whatever the offending agent was. So they kind of still did some offensive, kind of invasive treatments, but way less invasive than what conventional medicine was doing. So that's Samuel Thompson. The next group of individuals that were important were the eclectics. And these guys were a bunch of medical doctors, pharmacists, who were opposed to this, the conventional medicine at the time that was doing all this nasty stuff like bloodletting and using toxic metals. And they used a more integrated approach where they used herbalism and other sort of techniques to treat patients. And there's a number of important individuals, Lloyd, Scooter, Felcher, King, that wrote down a whole bunch of important information on these herbs. And they were really smart people that were documenting this stuff and trying to be as professional as possible with this information. And you can find King's American Dispensatory, you can find online for free. You can also go to the library. They're big books that are printed over 100 years ago. They're really kind of cool to read it. There's almost like a Shakespearean-like language when you read them. They're talking about treating scrofula and gleat and consumption. These are all old terms for tuberculosis or gonorrhea or consumption gleat. I can't remember the other thing I said. And I love reading about these books. And they used other things as well, but they were really good doctors. And I think they probably were able to help a lot of people. And so a lot of the knowledge that we have now that we practice as naturopaths dates back to a lot of the eclectic indications, which dates back on some of the Samuel Thompson stuff, which also incorporates some of the stuff that came from Europe. That also some of the traditional European medicine was also based on things that came out of Egypt and also things that came out of the Middle East as well. And then probably in the last 10 or 20 years, I've seen other herbs from Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine becoming more widely used in naturopathic medicine. For example, holy basil. Like when I graduated, I'd never heard about holy basil tea, or bacopa is another herb, or withania. I may have learned about that, but it's certainly become a very popular herb now. So basically, when you look at herbalism, it's constantly evolving. And a lot of the traditional indications for these herbs we've known about for thousands of years or hundreds of years. And often when the science comes out, it usually supports these traditional indications. And I'm sure there's lots of great herbal products that might end up having new indications that were never used traditionally because the science supports it for that. For example, with cancer treatment or whatever it may be. Um, so that's American herbalism. So what's interesting, one last thing about the eclectics is they were medical doctors, but in 1910, for political reasons, the College of Physicians, the American Medical Association, basically got down and wrote a whole bunch of guidelines saying, look, this is what a medical doctor does. If you don't practice what we've written down here in this sort of fashion, then you can't call yourself a doctor and you're out. And so these eclectic colleges that were in the U.S., that basically probably is where a lot of naturopathic teachings have evolved from. They were basically shut down due to politics, and that's always something that I think about. How here we had some great individuals doing some awesome work, and their organization just ceased to exist due to politics. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of get a little bit upset when I hear about negative press about against naturopaths, because if a bunch of naturopaths suddenly starts being really vocal and being super anti-vaccination, I could see politicians getting pressure from medical doctors and epidemiologists to be like, these guys are a bunch of quacks, we should shut them down. And that's whether there's truth or not in risks associated with vaccinations. I'm not even going to go there. But from a political standpoint, you have to be very careful what you say. And then occasionally you hear about some crazy naturopath saying that you just need to take baking soda to treat cancer. It's ridiculous. These aren't ones that have graduated from our colleges in Canada or probably the U.S. Maybe there are. But there's some kooky people out there that can make the rest of us look bad. So that's American herbalism. There is King. So here's a herb. Cedar grows all around the world, but this is yellow cedar. This is one of the most important herbs, one of the top 4 herbs used by the Ojibwe in Canada. I think they were in the US a bit as well. I've read somewhere that one of the treatments for scurvy, just as an aside, I always wonder, how did the First Nations people know about scurvy and what do they use to treat it? One thing they may have used is just making tea from the leaves of cedar for its vitamin C. That may be one way they prevented it. Another thing I was reading is that they used to eat the adrenal glands from whatever the animal was, a caribou or whatever the animal was first, because it concentrated vitamin C. So just kind of an interesting side note. Echinacea is very much a North American herb, and it's used as an immunostimulant. So it's an interesting herb. I don't use it a lot, but there are benefits of it. Goldenseal, one of my favorite herbs. I use this all the time. This is a great antimicrobial herb. There are other herbs similar to it used in herbal medicine around the world, but not this particular plant itself. So barberry and Oregon grape and coptis are all herbs that grow in different parts of the world that contain similar active ingredients, but not quite the same. But anyways, Goldenseal is awesome. And then black cohosh is used in Western herbalism for female complaints, including menopausal hot flashes, menstrual cramps, and a number of other female-related issues. But it was also used for snake bites, for rheumatic conditions like arthritis and back pain. And so when you read about these herbs, the list of indications is quite extensive. And appreciate that just because a herb says historically used for cancer doesn't mean it's the best thing to use for cancer. Like if you're in the Arctic and someone shows you a moss and says, yeah, this moss is used for cancer, um, there's not much biodiversity in the Arctic. So maybe they've only got like 50 plants up there that have good medicinal benefits. And so that particular moss is the best one they have. When you compare it to the biodiversity you'll see in like the tropics, like in a rainforest or in a jungle, where there's thousands and thousands of species of plants, the likelihood of having uh, medicinal chemicals in these plants is much greater, and they probably would be more effective. So I don't limit myself just to one plant from North America just because I like American herbalism. I try to use the best of from all around the world when I can. So, a few more things we'll talk about, then we'll take a break. Classification of botanical medicine. So there are different ways that herbalists or humans in general try to organize information. When it comes to herbal medicine, you can organize it by a number of different ways. So one way is through taxonomy. So as you know, plants have belong to various, well, everything that lives belongs to various kingdoms. So you've got animal kingdom, fungus, bacteria, plants. And then within the plants, there's different divisions, and then it goes down to all the way down, because I can't remember all of it right now, is down to family, and then genus and species. So when we're talking about herbal medicine, we focus primarily on the family and the genus and species, generally speaking. And that's one way to base it on from an evolutionary standpoint. And that's kind of a useful thing, because often you'll find members of the mint family all produce a lot of essential oils, or members of the Asteraceae family produce a lot of sesquiterpene lactones that are these bitter compounds. So that's one way you can classify it. It doesn't necessarily give you a full appreciation of the medical properties, but there's sometimes some trends that you'll see based on if herbs have overlapping genuses or families, okay? Another way you can divide plants is based on their actions. And so an action is sort of what it can do medicinally for you. So is it an anti-inflammatory, or is it an astringent, or is it a diuretic? And all these different medical properties can be assigned to a herb. So a single herb might have multiple actions associated with it. So it might be primarily an anti-inflammatory, but also have anti-cancer, astringent, diuretic properties. So I think every single herb will have more than one action associated with it. And it will have maybe a primary group of actions that this is the main thing we use this for. It's like the perfect herb for these things. And then it could have secondary actions where it's like, oh yeah, even though this is primarily used for respiratory tract infections, it also has a bit of a diuretic effect as well. So just to be aware of that. It wouldn't be my first choice to go with, but it's, it's still there. Another way you can organize herbs is based on the system. So certain herbs like hawthorn. When I think of hawthorn, I think of cardiovascular system. So it's usually used for congestive heart failure, but it also protects the heart. It has slight blood pressure lowering effects and a few other things. And so it's great for that. Other herbs may not be assigned to just one organ system. It might be assigned to multiple ones. So when you look at adaptogens, these herbs are used primarily for, so I would say a stress response, but they also have effects on the cardiovascular system, on the immune system, on digestion. They can affect numerous systems, okay? So when you're learning about it, you might learn about a herb in the cardiovascular system, but it'll also show up in the gastrointestinal system as well. Another thing that you can do is you can classify herbs based on their phytochemicals. And so we're going to have a few lectures after this one on the phytochemicals. And this is kind of a neat thing because all the medicinal properties associated with a plant are, these phytochemicals are responsible for them. So when you learn about these like sesquiterpenes or sesquiterpene lactones, when I hear sesquiterpene lactone, I immediately think in my head, a herb that contains these are going to help to stimulate digestion, and they're going to have some anti-inflammatory effects, and they're probably going to have some anti-cancer effects, whether that's a primary indication or not. So those are three things that I just attribute with almost any sesquiterpene lactone. Alkaloids are even a broader group, so you can't really make that classification with alkaloids in general. Alkaloids tend to be pretty potent compounds, but something like isoquinoline alkaloids, I could make some generalizations about that. And the way that the constituents are classified could be based on the synthetic pathways, or it could be about their structure, so we'll talk about that later on. And then another thing is that sometimes we'll talk about herbs. You might buy a book on Ayurvedic herbs, and those are going to be herbs that are that probably grow in South Asia, in India and surrounding areas, or South African herbs are going to really be isolated to those areas. And that's more of a cultural classification, cultural and geographical classification, less of a, indications or what you use them for. Linean system of classification. So again, everything is classified by this. This guy was the father of modern taxonomy. So kingdom, division, class, subclass, order, family, genus, species is how it goes. So everything that's living is classified by that. Plants, or sorry, herbs, we only really worry about the family, genus, and species. And I won't talk about a lot about these families, but I'll mention some of them as we go through it, because I definitely see some overlap in phytochemicals, and it doesn't surprise me if through an evolutionary standpoint, and things have evolved being, at one point all life came from the same single cell, and then it branches out from there. It's not surprising that the little manufacturing little factories these plants have over the years, there's going to be similarities with the phytochemicals, because eventually it's going to say, oh, we started making bioflavonoids here, and then specific ones later on. And so plants that are similar from an evolutionary standpoint, or from a taxonomy standpoint, are more likely to have similar phytochemicals they produce. Vitamin C is probably going to be in every single plant, but only an isoquinoline alkaloid called berberine will probably only be in a handful of plants. Okay. So yeah, kingdom, division, class, and order, I don't use at all. Family, genus, species are ones that I use. Okay. So we've got about an hour to go through the rest of it. Let's take a quick break now for 5 minutes. We'll come back at 10:30. If you guys have any question, write them down over here. I don't think anyone's asked me any questions. So come on back at 10:30 and we'll go from there, okay? All right, so I'm back. Someone said, I'm all of a sudden muted and I can't unmute anymore. That's probably because I muted myself, so you couldn't hear me. So you guys should be able to hear me now. Yep. So I got a question here. How did ancient cultures arrive at such botanical knowledge? Was it mostly trial and error and some sort of revelation to certain people, such as shamans and equivalent culture? Francisco, nobody really knows. I think, I think, in my opinion, uh, when there's probably a lot of different things. I suspect that when these days we have a lot more distracting things going on from like technology and everything else. I think people were used to being a little bit more quiet and still, and maybe they were able to be a little bit more in touch with their bodies, and especially some of the medical practitioners, shamans, or whoever else. Maybe they, were really focusing on their body's experience of these various herbs. I don't know whether or not uh, you know, intuition's usually it's not some magical thing. I think it's sort of people being a lot more perceptive on what's going on. So uh, some of it would be trial and error. Somebody eats a berry and they die, and they're like, "Ooh, don't do that again." Well, maybe some tribe is started eating a particular plant because it grew locally and nobody died, but then that tribe was getting healthier in some areas, or they found that they didn't get this type of sickness, so then other tribes learned about languages. It's really hard to know. It takes place over thousands and thousands of years, so uh, I'm uncertain how it all happens. Uh, Someone's asked me, is the Materia Medica written by Dioscorides the same as the one used in homeopathy? Nope, not at all. Materia Medica, just the name. It probably, I don't know what the exact translation means, but it's just that name has been adopted and used by other herbal texts sometimes. But the idea is just more of the individual monographs on all the different plants is comprised of that. So totally different than homeopathy, but a good question to ask. So drugs, herbs, and pharmacology. We're going to do a little comparison of the difference between drugs and herbs. So, as I mentioned earlier, druga is a word that means drugs. I think it's a herb, German name for plant. So, originally, all drugs were derived from plants. And now, the main difference between pharmaceutical drugs and herbs, I'll go through now. So, with most drugs, when you buy it, it tends to have only one active ingredient, or it could be have a couple things in there. Like there are certain cold and flu products that might have a decongestant and a like something that lowers the fever, something that might help you sleep, all combined in one. But typically, drugs usually have one active ingredient, maybe two. There are some cocktails of drugs out there for sure, but usually it's like less than three, I would say, or three or less active ingredients would probably cover 99% of drugs, I would think. Okay. When it comes to herbs, herbs could have, herbs almost always have multiple phytochemicals responsible for some of the medicinal properties. And it also will have some carbohydrates. It'll have some vitamins and minerals. Might even have some protein in it. So there's lots of stuff in a herbal product. So that's good, but it also complicates things. So sometimes researchers and medical doctors will refer to herbs as being dirty drugs, and there's already like a negative connotation associated with calling it a dirty drug because it just makes it sound like it's not good. And I think culturally we like things to be refined. We want things to be clean and you know, a single color is nice. You don't want things all mixed up. And so even when, like in the old days, people want like white rice because it seems, you know, what the elite would be eating, not unrefined rice. But the problem is every time you refine something, it changes it, and not always for the good. So I think it's great that herbs have uh, multiple chemicals in it. And if you look at like, I mean, it does complicate things from a research standpoint, but when you look at certain herbs, there could be 3 or 4 or 5 different compounds working together as a team to have a therapeutic effect. And appreciate going back to herbs, food is like that as well. Like if you just gave someone pure protein, pure fat, and pure carbohydrates, they're not going to do very well. They're going to die. So if you then say, oh, okay, the macronutrients is the proteins, fats, and carbs. So you're like, oh, you know what? We forgot to give them the micronutrients. So then you give them all the vitamins and minerals. So if you just gave someone a protein powder that only had vitamins and minerals and protein, fat, and carbohydrates, they would they would stay alive for a period of time, but they're not going to do very well. You know, no matter how you formulate that, they're not going to do great. And because you've purified nutrition down to just the bare essentials, but there are a bunch of things in your diet that are called non-essential nutrients that you don't technically need, that all work synergistically to help prevent cancer and heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's and all these other degenerative diseases. And so technically you don't need bioflavonoids, certain carotenoids, but they work together as a team to make you healthy. And so herbs are kind of like you're taking a team. I'm not saying that herbs are always better than drugs, but there are some really cool things about herbs that you get because of the synergy, because of all these compounds working together. Now, the next thing, difference between drugs and herbs, is the quality. Drugs are better quality in some ways than herbs are. And the reason why I say that, and I'm kind of using that term loosely, is because when you buy a drug, it should, I mean, it's not always the case, it should be pure. It should basically have 99 point whatever percentage of the active ingredient that's listed on the bottle. Like you don't want to go and buy a blood pressure medication and it turns out that it's got a bunch of other stuff in it that you don't want. When it comes to herbs, the big issue is that herbs can vary from batch to batch. So if you look at, for example, wine, grapes that are grown in Italy in the mountains are different than ones that grow at sea level, or they're different than those that grow in California, or slightly different than those ones, or different than ones that grow in Australia. And there could be certain phytochemicals. There may be more resveratrol grown, found in the wine if it's grown in certain regions and not in other regions, or it might have more of the anthocyanidins that give it that purple color if it's grown in certain areas and make it a slightly different tasting wine. So when you look at wine, you've got white wine and you've got all these different red wines. They're the same genus, the same species. I think it's the same genus and species. Actually, I don't want to say that for certain, but there are a lot of different varieties. There might be some other, I'm going to have to Google that, but there's different, I'm sure there's different species of grapes, but most of the ones they used in wines probably come from, could be some different genus and species and then a lot of different varieties. But the same genus and species and variety could be grown in a different area, or it could be grown in the exact same area, and the next year it'll be different. And that's why maybe a 2005 Rioja is better than the 2008, just because of the way it's expressing certain phytochemicals that year. It doesn't mean that it's that much better for you. It tastes a little bit different. There will be different health benefits. You know, all red wine in general is going to be better for you than white wine because it has those purple compounds in it that the white wine doesn't, and that's due to the way that it's processed. But you know, whether you have the 2005 or 2006 Rioja from, or comparing it to a Cabernet Sauvignon that grows in Australia, there will be differences in the taste and maybe some of the phytochemicals. They're still probably all going to be good for you, though. So anyway, that's the quality aspect of it. And the same thing with the potency. When you compare drugs to herbs, I would say that drugs tend to be more potent. They tend to be stronger. But stronger or being more powerful is not always a good thing. And the analogy I like to give people is like when you have a job you got to get done, you can use different types of tools, and getting a powerful tool isn't always going to be the best tool for the job. And so, for example, if you're an archaeologist and you want to go and uncover some ancient ruins, using a bulldozer will get the job done, and that's a really powerful tool, far more powerful than a man or a woman with a brush and a shovel. But the disadvantage of using the bulldozer is you can damage the structure. So there are times that you want to use a powerful tool because otherwise you'll never get the job done. And in some cases, there's a bit of a race against time in order to get the job done. And you might need to use, if you've got a flood coming, you may have to use a bulldozer and damage a few structures just to save the village. Or if you're, in medicine, if you're trying to treat cancer, yeah, you might need to go in there with surgery, radiation, and chemotherapeutic drugs that basically destroys almost everything, including the body, to save the person's life. But if there are cases where you got a little bit of joint pain, you don't necessarily want to go in there with the most powerful anti-inflammatory drug because it'll cause a stomach ulcer or other problems. Okay, so drugs are definitely stronger, more powerful than herbs are, but it doesn't mean that the herbs don't get the job done. And what I generally find is that herbs and dietary changes, because there's a huge overlap there. Herbs, let's say if I'm treating an infection, if you get the right antibiotic, it's very powerful and very precise, and it can go in and knock out that bug in like 24 to 48 hours. It really can. And herbs generally don't work that fast. It might take a couple of weeks. So if I had severe meningitis, bacterial meningitis, I want to go with the drugs for certain. Hardcore antibiotics. I don't care if it messes up my gut flora. I'll deal with that later. But if I've got like chronic vaginal yeast infections, well, I wouldn't have those. But I mean, if someone had that, I was treating a patient with it, and they didn't respond well to the drugs, I can give them herbs, antifungal herbs, but it might take a month or longer to see improvement. But they do work, they just take longer. But they also have less side effects, generally speaking. Another difference between drugs and herbs is that drugs can be patented from a business standpoint. If you spend $10 million in research, you've got to make your money back. And so the FDA and Health Canada will allow people to patent drugs for, I don't know if it's 10 years or however long, where you have exclusive rights so you can basically sell your brand new antibiotic or anti-inflammatory drug, and nobody else can make it but you, so you can make your money back. And then after that, generic companies are able to manufacture it and sell it for a cheaper price. So that's a great incentive for people to conduct research, and otherwise there's no point. You can't patent herbs, and you might be able to patent like some proprietary blend or some extraction process, but you can't patent chamomile tea, for example. You can't say that everybody has to give me money if they try to sell chamomile tea. You just can't do that. And because of that, there's not going to be as much research going in to prove that chamomile tea can improve indigestion. There will be thousands of studies going into PPI drugs, acid blocking drugs, for helping with heartburn or indigestion. Nobody's going to spend the money to do 1,000 studies on chamomile if they can't make their money back. It just why would you do that? So the disadvantage of this is that from an evidence-based model in medicine, naturally there is a greater body of evidence supporting drugs than supporting gluten-free diets or taking some herbal teas. Like, And so people assume that because there's less research in diet and herbs, that it's not going to be as efficacious. But that's not the case. It's just less research, right? In the ideal world, herbal research would be funded to the same degree as drugs, and then you do comparisons head to head. What works better, this drug or this herb? Which one's safer? I'd like to see more studies like that. And there are some, but there's just not as much, and that's because drugs can't or herbs can't be patented. The final thing is when it comes to herbs, because they contain multiple chemicals, they generally a herbal monograph could have over a dozen medicinal actions associated with that herb, while drugs tend to have less indications. An exception to that, certain antihistamines might be useful as an antiemetic to help with nausea and vomiting. It could be used as a sleep aid because they can act as a sedative, and may be useful for allergies as an antihistamine. So, certain antihistamine drugs they'll change the same active ingredient can be put into 3 different bottles and marketed for sleep, motion sickness, or nausea, and for allergies. But most drugs usually are like an anti-inflammatory drug, like ibuprofen. It really is just marketed for pain management, arthritis. Aspirin is marketed for pain relief, but also as a blood thinner. But it would be rare to have more than 3 actions associated with a drug. Herbs, on the other hand, will have lots of actions, and there are lots of herbal actions that the pharmaceutical equivalent doesn't really exist. And so, for example, there are herbs used to help the body cope with stress. These are called adaptogens. There's no drug that it works as an adaptogen at this point. Or alternative herbs are used as blood cleansers, and they're used to help people with skin conditions and other things. There's no drug alternatives. Digestive bitters, there's no drug. Phytoestrogens, which are modulated estrogen receptors, referred to more of as a partial agonist. There's probably not a lot of these in the drug world. There could be some, but I don't know. So herbal medicine and research. So all I did was went into PubMed and I typed in herbal medicine in PubMed. And this was basically the number of studies that came out. Now appreciate, that was just when I typed in herbal medicine. If you type in an individual herb, you could have that many studies just for an individual herb. But this is just the broad topic of herbal medicine. You can see it's growing exponentially in the last 20 years, like without a doubt. So basically in the last 10 years, there's more research has been conducted on herbal medicine than probably the 100,000 years before that. And I've even found that the amount of research since I graduated in 2003, there's all these cool studies coming out that just didn't exist. And there's herbs that I'd learned about but didn't have any clinical trials to support that now they are starting to support, which is kind of neat. So when it comes to research on herbal medicine, I would say there are some really good studies supporting certain herbs. Like St. John's wort has a lot of research showing that it's beneficial for at least mild and probably moderate depression. And some studies even say it works for severe depression. And it appears to work as effective as pharmaceutical drugs without the side effects. So from an evidence-based model, we shall be using St. John's wort as a first-line drug against depression. Medical doctors never do, or rarely do, I shouldn't say never. Maybe in certain cultures, like in Germany, they use it more than they do in North America. North America, I don't think very many medical doctors would recommend it. That may not discourage people from doing it, but they're not going to recommend it necessarily. Rather, some might. I mean, personally, I don't recommend people use it as, I usually go with other things first. It's not my first approach to treating depression, mainly because there are some side effects, less than antidepressant some, but most people with mild or moderate depression, um, that's not what I think they should be doing. I usually look at making sure they don't have any iron deficiency, make sure their vitamin B6s, maybe supplement with a little bit of that. I might give them 5-HTP, which is a building block for serotonin. I'll refer them to get mindfulness done, give them some, encourage sleep, encourage exercise, maybe give them fish oil. Like there's lots of other things you can do beyond just giving them an antidepressant drug or an antidepressant herb. And St. John's wort is still messing with neurotransmitters in a way that's not entirely natural, even though it's more natural than the antidepressant drugs. Okay, so there's lots of good research, but there's a lot of herbs that I use in practice that I would say there's not a single study that's ever been conducted on it for the particular indication. For example, a herb that I use called gentian for digestive upset. Gentiana lutea is the herb that I use that's originally from the Alps. And I love that herb. I use it all the time. There's not a lot of clinical trials to support it for digestive issues. There's more coming out, but there's not a lot. There's some other species of gentian used in Chinese medicine, some other cultures that have a little bit more research, but not a lot with the one that I used. I still use it all the time and it works great. And I'm choosing to use it based on traditional indications, not based on clinical trials. Okay. And I think if you want to only recommend treatments based on double-blind clinical trials, you're going to have a hard time practicing herbal medicine effectively, in my opinion. There's just not enough studies yet. In the one day you might be able to, but right now there's just not a lot. I mean, there's only a handful of things that you can really rely on. Allison's asking me, gentian lutea. It'll come later on. It's just GENTIAN is the common name for it, or yellow gentian. So to give you a story of research that's been done on herbs and some of the reasons why I've become kind of disillusioned with the importance of research in herbal medicine is the story of Artemisinin. So I didn't take this photo. I ripped off of National Geographic. It's a beautiful photo. I like the color of the purple and the green. Here is somebody in Tanzania, and they're harvesting a herb called Chinese wormwood, which is Artemisia annua. And this is used for anti-malaria, as an anti-malarial. And they're growing it because the drugs are very expensive. I'm going to give you a little story of this that originally came from China. And Chinese wormwood, King Hao, I guess it's pronounced. Early Chinese texts have recorded the use of this herb dating back to about 200 BC. So it's been used for over 2,000 years. In the 1960s, they did a study in a test tube, so in an in vitro, meaning in glass study, showing that some crude extracts from this plant had anti-malarial activity. And then in 1984, they did the first human trial that was published in the Lancet, which is a Western journal, and basically showed benefit against malaria. And then 20 years went by, and it wasn't until 2005 that artemisinin-based combinational therapies became the first-line therapy against chloroquine-resistant malaria. And so it took a long time before the World Health Organization finally recognized that this is the drug we should be using. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is we knew that it was useful for malaria 2,000 years ago because even though they didn't know what malaria was in ancient China, they recognized that people have a certain type of symptoms that could be treated with this herb. And when they started isolating the drug, I can appreciate why they didn't want to maybe start using it or recommending it in the 1960s. But in the 1990s, there was more than a sufficient evidence. So even after hundreds and hundreds of clinical trials had been conducted on this herb, it still wasn't, basically, they would have had clinical trials and systematic reviews conducted. And even when there was enough evidence, according to the Western medical model, to sort of approve these things, it still took another 10 years for policymakers to sit down and say, you know what, we should probably change things. And that's the problem, is that even when the research is there, doctors, what they're prescribing in their offices, there's going to be a huge delay. And so I'm a little bit disillusioned of like, so in that basically 20-year period, when the first clinical trial was done, and before it was finally approved, sure, maybe it wouldn't have been approved in 1984, but add on 5 more years or 10 more years, thousands and thousands of people died who didn't need to die. So right now, this artemisinin is still considered to be the most effective anti-malaria treatment in treating basically chloroquine-resistant malarial strains. It's never given alone. It's combined with other herbs to prevent drug resistance because it's really good at clearing it, but it's still good to combine it with some other things. So I think that's a really neat story. So appreciate, even though we've been using it for 2,000 years, before medical doctors finally say, oh yeah, you know what, maybe there's something to do, maybe this herb might be useful, it's got to go through, I don't know how many millions or billions of dollars of research before it gets approved, you know? So don't expect chamomile tea to be adopted anytime soon for, you know, stomach aches by conventional medicine. Now, as an aside, if you're just curious how these things work, so with malaria, the way that what happens is the parasites invade the red blood cells. Hemoglobin, which is safe inside the red blood cell, liberates something called free heme. And free heme is quite toxic because the iron acts as a pro-oxidant. So iron is very toxic in our bodies, and that's one of the reasons why eating a lot of red meat is bad for things like colon cancer, because it has iron generates pro-oxidants, just like how smoking and pollution does. And these pro-oxidants can damage the cell. So our bodies, our red blood cells, will naturally try to sequester free heme and form polymers called hemozoin that'll neutralize the iron so it doesn't cause harm. And inside these parasitic cells, our cells don't do that. The parasites do this with using an enzyme called heme polymerase to sequester the toxic heme. And if you put artemisinin in these cells, what ends up happening is this iron reacts with the artemisinin, and this artemisinin has, see these little two oxygens stuck together? That's called a peroxide bridge. These are really, just like hydrogen peroxide is really susceptible to iron and will generate free radicals. This compound will too. So in the presence of free heme, this peroxide bridge gets oxidized, forming a free radical that then will stick to DNA, protein, and other lipids and cause damage. So again, here you can see the amount of research conducted on artemisinin, and when it was finally approved, it was way down in here. Research is now declining because it's sort of like not as important now as it was initially, because there's quite a bit done, but it's just neat to see the history of this. So lots of other drugs originally came from plants. I'm going to give you just list a few of them. So another anti-malarial drug is called quinine, and it came from a plant that grows in Peru called chinchona bark, or Jesuit's bark, and it was used by indigenous people in South America to treat malaria. And it wasn't until the 1500s Jesuits priests came from Europe, sort of observed the indigenous people using it, and they said, well, you know, we had a malaria problem back in Europe. So they basically brought it back to Europe. Extracts were conducted in the 17th century and used to treat malaria. In 1820, quinine, which is the main alkaloid in it, was extracted, and it was given as a first-line drug against malaria until about the 1940s. Quinine itself is pretty toxic, and you may know that tonic water, which is that bitter soft drink that most people don't like, what gives it the bitter quality is quinine. The reason why tonic water has its name is, in addition to acting as an antimalarial, it helps to tonify the digestive tract because of the bitter properties. And so the early British soldiers who were traveling around and had quinine rations for preventing malaria when they're in Africa, they would mix it with soda water and add a whole bunch of sugar to it to make it more palatable. And that's where the whole idea of tonic water came from. So quinine is still considered by the World Health Organization to be an essential medicine, but it's no longer really the primary treatment because they've done modifications of quinine to come up with other drugs that are more effective and have less drug resistance. But I still wonder if chinchonum bark, the whole plant, is more effective and less likely to become drug resistant than quinine in isolation by itself. Because you might be able to use the whole herb and use a lower dose to have it effective if you're drinking as a tea or a decoction than taking as the herb. And I'll give you an explanation for this later on. So quinine, the take home is used for malaria, found in tonic water, and that's probably the most important things about it. Now, what's interesting, just so we're talking about mechanisms of action, I like understanding these. When the hemoglobin makes the free heme, that's what the artemisinin reacts with. And then the enzyme called heme polymerase, which basically takes this toxic heme and makes polymers that are safe so that the parasite, the malaria parasites don't die. Quinine knocks out this enzyme called heme polymerase. So appreciate one of the reasons why artemisinin and it's combined with other herbs that they have a synergistic effect because the quinine targets one enzyme involved with the toxicity of free heme, and the peroxide makes the free heme even more. So the artemisinin makes the free heme even more toxic. So combining quinine with the artemisinin will make it even more effective than one given in isolation. Okay. Another important herb is foxglove. Foxglove was the source of digoxin, which is one of the first drugs used for treating congestive heart failure. And it's considered an essential medicine by the World Health Organization, and it basically was discovered in the 1700s. A medical doctor called William Withering was treating a patient for a condition called dropsy. And what that is basically congestive heart failure that causes the ankles to swell up with water because the heart can't pump efficiently anymore. And as a result, you get all this swelling and edema from water pooling in the ankles. And this patient came in and said, yeah, sorry, I can't help you with that. The patient went off, talked to some local herbalist, came back a couple weeks later and went to the doctor and said, yeah, I'm all doing better. This local herbalist gave me this plant and, cured me. Didn't really cure him, but helped me. And so then Dr. Withering said, oh, that's cool. And he went and found out what the plant was and basically documented it. He took all the credit, and we don't know who that local herbalist was. So that always happens. Whoever writes the books are always the ones who get the credit for it. So what digoxin does is it acts as a positive ionotropic. And what that means is it increases calcium ions flowing into the heart to cause a more forceful contraction. So it increases the forced contractions in the heart. Negative chronotropic means chrono means time. And so it slows down the heart rate. So increases the forced contraction, slows the heart rate down to make the pump work more effectively. It also indirectly works as a diuretic to kind of help pee out that extra bit of water. So it's not used as much in medicine anymore, but it was a really important drug for the longest time. There's digoxin. Oops, my slide was going to skip ahead there. Digoxin's the compound that showed up there. Now, ephedrine we mentioned already twice in the last couple of lectures. The ancient Neanderthals had this. Also, the ancient Egyptians were using this. Ephedra is the source of ephedrine, which is, you will find it in a lot of daytime sinus and cold medications because it acts as a bronchodilator and it basically causes vasoconstriction in the sinuses to act as a decongestant. Okay, and so it also increases heart rate and does some other things as well because it stimulates all the sympathetic nervous system. but ephedra is considered on the list of World Health Organization's essential medicines again, uh, and an important drug that we'll come back to later on. And there's the structure there. You guys can see it better. Ephedrine structurally looks a little bit like epinephrine with a few little distinctions. So it kind of modulates some receptors that can have an effect on the sympathetic nervous system. Now, probably everyone's heard of willow bark as a source for aspirin. It's not entirely true. It's partially true. Willow bark contains something called salicylic acid, and salicylic acid is ubiquitous in nature, meaning it's all over the place. So when you eat a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, you are consuming small amounts of salicylic acid. Okay, I'm going to exit this so you can see the structure of it, because my slides move around when they shouldn't. So salicylic acid is a phenolic compound. I've highlighted it here. Aspirin, so salicylic acid is what you find in high amounts in willow bark and some other herbs. Acetylsalicylic acid is what aspirin is. So what that is basically in a lab they've gone and stuck something called this acetyl group onto the salicylic acid. That allows them to actually to patent it because they changed the structure of it. So when they were doing the research on it, traditionally willow bark was used for fevers and for pain. So it does help with that. It also has a blood thinning effect. Charles Gerhardt, he created the acetylsalicylic acid in a lab in the late 1800s. Bayer, the big drug company, started selling it as aspirin. Okay, and so aspirin is another thing considered to be an essential drug by the World Health Organization. Adding that acetyl group does change some of the properties a little bit, but willow bark still works for pain. I'd love to see a comparison of someone drinking a tea from willow bark and how, if it's less effective or more effective than aspirin, and also is it more likely or less likely to cause a stomach ulcer, because I don't know. Salicylic acid alone definitely causes stomach ulcers. There's no doubt about that. And adding the acetyl group might help to reduce that. Now that acetyl group is reversibly, can be knocked off of that, but it also might go and modify some of the enzymes, get attached to some of the enzymes involved with inflammation. So what I'm saying here is, unlike artemisinin, digoxin, and ephedrine, those all exist in nature. Aspirin, acetylsalicylic acid, doesn't exist in nature. It's slightly modified from a compound that was naturally occurring in numerous plants, including willow bark, used to treat inflammation. So same indications, but they have modified it slightly. Now, adding acetyl group, your body does acetylate things all the time. So your liver can do this, and other probably cells in your body can do it. When you buy vitamin C, when you buy alpha tocopherol, it usually is acetyl alpha tocopherol because it's used to stabilize it. Acid, some bases, some enzymes will just naturally get rid of the acetyl group, just FYI. So it's not really that unnatural modification, okay? So that's aspirin. So on an exam, I might ask you, does aspirin come from willow bark? And the answer is no, it doesn't. It's similar to it, but it's not the same compound, okay? You don't find aspirin in willow bark. So Tamiflu is an important antiviral drug. And a few years ago, when I think SARS and there was another big threat from some kind of flu pandemic, the world started stockpiling Tamiflu. And Tamiflu is a drug, and I want to emphasize it does not exist in nature in any form. Okay, so when they started making Tamiflu, one of the reasons why the price of star anise, which you should have a picture of star anise on your, I don't know if I can go back to, there it is, and it's gone. Star anise, the cost of that plant or that herb went up tenfold in a short period of time. And the reason why is that star anise, it does not contain Tamiflu, but it contains a precursor called shikimic acid. Shikimic acid is used by certain plants to make certain amino acids. And so that's the building block. And then it goes on to make some other things. We don't make shikimic acid, but certain plants do. And when you're making drugs in a lab, you don't want to start with one carbon and try to build it from there. If you can extract something that's easy and inexpensive to get from nature and then modify that, you've saved a whole bunch of steps and it'll make it more cost effective for you. So shikimic acid is isolated from star anise, but you can get it in lots of different plants. It's just star anise has particularly high amounts of it, so it makes it, and it's easy to grow in a lot of tropical regions, so it's pretty inexpensive. It's also used in Asian cooking, star anise. We made dumplings on the weekend, and Chinese five spice has star anise in it, and some other things. So shikimic acid is used in the lab to as a building block to make Tamiflu. Okay, and Tamiflu is considered to be an essential medicine now. Now, although you can use shikimic acid to make Tamiflu, I want to remind you guys that Tamiflu does not exist in nature, and that drinking star anise tea is not going to have the same benefits as taking Tamiflu, the drug. Star anise might have some antiviral properties. I don't really know that for certain, but it's not the same. You know, so if you had a really serious viral infection, and someone said, "Oh, don't take Tamiflu, just take star anise," I don't think that would be fair to say. There's other herbs you could try. I know that licorice may actually work better than Tamiflu for certain viral infections, but that's a side story we can go into another time. I got a couple of questions that came up. I'm going to come back to you guys in a second, okay? Because I kind of skipped over those slides. So I'm going to exit this. I don't know why. After I updated my file from an old version of Keynote, my slides got all messed up. I haven't been able to find every bug yet. So another important drug is Taxol. There's a few different types of names for this drug and different versions of it, but paclitaxel, also known as Taxol, is an important anti-cancer drug. And I remember when in university, so in the late 90s, I took a natural products course, which is pretty cool. And at the time, the big issue that was confronting researchers at the time in the natural products field was that we discovered an anti-cancer drug from something called Pacific U. And the way that they discovered it is they basically take thousands of plant extracts and put them into little wells on a plate, and then they add cancer cells to it, and then they monitor it to see which of these compounds that they've isolated are effective or not. So it's not based on any kind of traditional knowledge. You're just randomly screening millions of plants in hopes of finding something that has some medicinal properties that they can then turn into a drug. Okay, it's pretty cool. And so the Pacific U does not have any traditional uses for cancer, to the best of my knowledge. Okay, so this Taxol is shown to be highly effective against several different types of cancers, ovarian and breast cancer, and they've shown this in clinical trials. But the problem is that to make the Taxol was very, very difficult. If you look at the structure of this, there's all these chiral centers on this. I don't know how many exactly. Chiral center means is when you're trying to make this in a lab, and I used to work as a synthetic chemist for a short period of time, you make something. If it has a chiral center, that means you get at least 50% of a right hand and 50% of the left hand. And then you make another one, you get another 50% or 50% at least. And so what happens if you're starting off with let's say 100 grams of starting material, and if there's a lot of chiral centers on it, that means that by the time you get down to the end, you may have wasted 99 or 90% or 95% of the various building blocks required along the way. And so it becomes very, very expensive to make this with a lot of waste. And so the big issue is there's a big complex structure, so they couldn't make it. It's prohibitively expensive to make it in a lab. And the other problem they had was, let's say, if they tried to obtain it from natural sources, they would basically would have to go and clear cut all these specific yew trees. And after 1 or 2 years, they basically would have exploited everything they could, and there'd be no other trees left on the planet. And so they wouldn't be able to meet the demand. So they couldn't make it in the lab, cost effective enough to help people, and they couldn't get it from nature to basically meet the demands. So eventually what they ended up doing, just as an aside, is they used biotechnology and using plant cell fermentation. So in little test tubes, or I guess not test tubes, they probably use huge vats that they make this. They somehow figured out the enzymes from the plants and we're making their, so it's kind of cool. I like biotechnology when it's, genetically modified things when it remains in a lab. It's kind of cool and really useful stuff. When it gets introduced into the wild, I have my concerns with that. But anyways, only now are we seeing all the damaging effects of Monsanto. I mean, it's been going on for, that's another problem with research is Monsanto has been poisoning the soil for decades. But because the research has been inconclusive showing causing harm, nobody's, they keep doing it. It's only now that Monsanto, right after, it's funny because Bayer, the big drug company that makes aspirin, they ended up buying Monsanto, the ones who produce Roundup. And right after they bought it, all these cases came up of people suing Monsanto, and they started winning because they were exposed to Roundup and got cancer. And so Bayer's stock basically just plummeted. I don't know where it is now these days, but Monsanto is evil company. There's some good documentaries on, not somebody I like. So I like GMO when it's kept in the lab for this purpose, but not so much for encouraging people to overuse pesticides and stuff. So that's Taxol. So the take home here, it exists in nature, was not used traditionally as a drug, but is now available as a drug. It's considered one of the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, and it's obtained from plant cell fermentation. Okay, a couple questions came up here. Well, we need to know the structure. No way, of course you would need to know the structure. Most of you guys are not chemists. I put the structures in there because for some of you, maybe they mean something. It's a different language that you're not required to know, okay? Is salicylic acid in face wash derived from willow bark also? Salicylic acid is used like as a chemical peel for acne, and also I think for burning off some warts. It's probably just, I doubt it comes from willow bark. They probably just, I don't know how they get it. It's probably made in the lab. It's not, salicylic acid would be very easy to make in the lab, so I don't know how they make it, but it would be easy to. So aspirin is modified to salicylic acid with an acetyl group. So doesn't that mean it is from willow bark but modified? I don't know where they originally get the salicylic acid from. Like I said, it's a very simple compound to make in a lab. It's like, it's so early on in the, like if you had a phenolic comp, all you have to do is take a phenol group and then add a carboxylic acid group onto it. So you could synthetically make that without any difficulty whatsoever, and you wouldn't necessarily have to obtain the building blocks from like plants, because plants might be more expensive. I would think they probably just get it from some chemicals, some, I don't know how they get it, some rocks or some solvents or whatever they get it from. I don't know where they get all that stuff from. Oh, so you're asking where you're going to get the lecture today? It'll be posted on Moodle. It'll probably be posted Wednesday at the latest, okay? I didn't post last week's because everybody was in class. If you weren't in class and you want last week, just email me. I'll send you the link directly. Okay, So when it comes to pharmacology, a couple names that are worth knowing. Pharmacology is the study of the interaction of biologically active agents with living systems. So this would be you take some kind of substance and you study how it interacts with enzymes or transporters or whatever it may be to see the effects. And pharmacognosy is a division of pharmacology that looking at things that have medicinal properties derived from natural sources. So that could be herbs, like so if it comes from plants, that could be one area, or it could be animals, could be sponges from the ocean, could be microorganisms, and so basically some kind of living things producing chemicals that may be useful in medicine. Okay, and then toxicology. I think everyone can figure out if it's toxic. Look at how these substances could hurt living systems, organisms, and we care mostly about humans, but also other animals. So pharmacokinetics, there's two terms called pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics. Pharmacokinetics basically looks at what happens to a drug when it's put into the body. So normally when you take a pill, that pill enters your mouth and then it will eventually be absorbed, whether it's in the mouth or the esophagus or the stomach or in the large or small intestine, like it depends on what the substance is. It gets absorbed, eventually makes its way into your bloodstream, and then over time it gets eliminated from the body. And so pharmacokinetics measures what your body does to the drug. So how it absorbs it, where it ends up accumulating, does it end up, in your fat cells, does your kidneys excrete it, does it get metabolized by the liver with phase 1 or phase 2 detox, like what's going on with it. So everything that gets put into your body kind of follows a type of curve like this. Ignore that little lip at the bottom. Let's just ignore that. It doesn't start going up again. It just goes down. If you inject it, it still could go through this, but you're going to bypass certain things. So you'll probably get a much higher amount in your blood. And the curve may not be as broad. It may be like a higher, quicker spike and then eliminate a little bit faster as well. But so drug goes in, stomach, intestines, blood, metabolized by liver, excreted through bile into the feces, through the intestines, out through the feces, or through urine, or it could be excreted through the skin, like through sweat, or you may breathe out certain compounds that are volatile. So that's what pharmacokinetics looks at, how the body affects a drug. Pharmacodynamics is different, where you're basically studying how does the drug interact with the body and have its effect. And normally, most drugs and herbs, not all of them, but most drugs and herbal constituents, phytochemicals, interact with various proteins in the body to exert some kind of effect. And so it's kind of like proteins in the body are like having like a key, a hole, like the key is the drug and the keyhole and the door and the lock is what the drug binds to and then unlocks something in the body. And so if you have an agonist, it basically binds to a particular receptor and turns it on. Okay? If you have an antagonist, it binds to a receptor and turns it off or blocks it. Okay? So if we're talking about estrogen receptors in the body, there are different types of estrogen receptors. An agonist for those receptors would be obviously estrogen and probably progesterone to some degree, but also environmental estrogens like bisphenol, which is found in plastics. It'll bind and really tightly bind to these receptors and turn it on. And then an antagonist to an estrogen receptor would be the drug tamoxifen, which goes in there and blocks that receptor. So when you block it, that means that other compounds like estrogen or bisphenol are unable to bind to it, and as a result, it shuts down those estrogenic effects. So in women, that would basically drive them into a chemically induced menopause. And then another type of agonists are what are called modulators or partial agonists. And these would be considered to be very weak drugs. So, for example, phytoestrogens like soy and flax are partial agonists for estrogen receptors. What they do is they go and partially turn it on. So if your estrogen levels are really low because you're menopausal, it might stimulate it slightly. If your estrogen levels are really high because you're being exposed to, let's say, bisphenol from drinking water out of certain plastic bottles, in this case, the bisphenol is constantly activating these estrogen receptors, but when you take something like flax or soy, it might go in there and displace these rather toxic estrogens and reduce your over-estrogenic levels, because it sort of, things like flax and soy, it only stimulates a little bit, but while occupying those receptors, it blocks more toxic things from coming into it. So some things will bind strongly to the receptor and completely turn it on. Other things, no matter how much you put into, no matter how much soy you take, you're never going to turn soy is never fully going to turn estrogen receptors on because it's a partial. And then an antagonist completely shuts off that activity. Okay, so that's just sort of a graph where at the top it's like 100% activity, and as you go to the right, it's how much a greater concentration of it. So there's a certain point where if you take, let's say, 1 gram of these various things, some of them will fully turn it on, some of it will partially turn it on, and some of it will turn it off. Okay. Now, an example of this, here's an estrogen receptor. You've got estrogen binding in it. And those little OH group are required to basically turn on these little amino acids, bind to those things to basically cause a conformational change in the enzyme that'll basically release something that has responsible for the estrogenic effect. So estrogen binds to it pretty good. Here's a phytoestrogen. The phytoestrogen binds to it as well, but not as good. It doesn't quite fit. It's not as close a fit. So it's a little bit further away, so it has to kind of wiggle around to make it turn on. So when it's occupying this, it may only be turning it on 40% of the time, and the rest of the time, it'll block other agonists and antagonists from binding to the active site. And that's why some people are worried that if you're taking the drug tamoxifen, that soy could have a negative effect. But it also appears to have a protective effect against other things. Like, for example, here's bisphenol. Bisphenol binds to the estrogen receptor even better than estrogen does. So even really tiny amounts of this, it'll go and bind in there, and it'll just get stuck in there and doesn't want to leave, and just is constantly turning those estrogen receptors on. And so that's why things like bisphenol greatly increase the risk of breast cancer. And things like soy and flaxseed they don't cause breast cancer. If anything, they lower the risk for breast cancer. And I always think it's funny because people are like, oh, soy causes cancer. Well, if you're getting all worried about phytoestrogens causing cancer, then maybe if you're concerned about breast cancer, maybe look at the meat and cheese and eggs that you're eating, because there's a link that they have a greater link to cancer than any soy product does. And the research shows that soy either does nothing for preventing breast cancer, causes no harm or no good, or it lowers the risk for breast cancer, depending on the study you look. So at worst, it doesn't do anything. At best, it might protect you. And we know flax is another thing that's a phytoestrogen that seems to protect people. And also men get all weird and they're like, oh, phytoestrogen's bad. I don't want to do phytoestrogens. That sounds like it's, not a good thing for a man to eat. But then they'll go and drink beer, which is loaded with phytoestrogens. And those phytoestrogens actually have a greater effect on the estrogen receptors in breast tissue. So a lot of men who drink excess amounts of beer, especially hoppy beers, they'll start suffering from low libido and breast tissue stimulation. Soy and flax don't seem to have any kind of stimulatory effect on breast tissue. And so it seems to have more of an antagonistic effect in the breast rather than a partial agonist. It's a little bit more on the blocking side of things than on the turning on side of things. While hops seems to be more on a little bit more of a stimulating effect on breast tissue, which is maybe one of the reasons why hops is also used as a galacticol to stimulate milk production in women. So there's just the same thing I just showed you before. Here's estrogen top left, bisphenol top right, genistein, which is from soy, bottom left, that's a partial agonist or a phytoestrogen, and then the antagonist, tamoxifen, it fits in the receptor. It doesn't have those OH groups at all, so it can't basically turn this on at all, but it just likes to sit in there and turn everything off. So that's how the chemistry, so even though I would say genistein and estrogen don't look anything alike, their three-dimensional structure allows them to interact with the various little amino acids that make up these receptors. So it's kind of cool stuff. So we're talking about pharmacology. So there you can have an agonist, which turns on, an antagonist that turns on, or a partial agonist that basically kind of turns it on, but also kind of turns it off. And a lot of herbs, the reason why they're not very powerful compared to drugs is a lot of them are kind of partial agonists. They kind of turn things on, kind of turn things off. So chamomile tea, for example, it works on the GABA system, so it has a gentle calming effect. It's not as powerful as like Valium or barbiturate is, but the nice thing is if you have a couple cups of chamomile tea after you've had a few drinks, you're not going to overdose and die. While with barbiturates, you drink a bunch of alcohol and pop a couple of barbiturates, there's a good chance you could overdose and die, like a lot of famous people in the 50s and 60s, like Marilyn Monroe and Jimi Hendrix and some other famous rock stars and actresses and actors. So dose response curves, you don't really need to know this stuff for the exam. Just appreciate that, generally speaking, the more you take something, the more of an effect you have. Now, the purple things mean that less is required to have a stronger effect. So you got to, so bisphenol in purple there is stronger than estrogen, more potent than estrogen. So you only need a little bit to have a powerful effect, okay? Now, these aren't entirely accurate. I'm just sort of explaining. Well, the orange curve is your partial agonist, where it means at some point the effects plateau, and no matter how much flax you give someone, you're never going to fully stimulate those receptors. It'll just saturate them and never is going to have that effect, okay? And then in this case, tamoxifen does nothing, no matter how much you take. And it's usually more because it has to be combined with estrogen compounds for it to exert its effect. So if there's no, most receptors aren't doing anything until you put the, it kind of neutralizes the agonist and partial agonist, okay? So when you're in herbal medicine or with drugs, when you start adding things together, you can have different outcomes. So 1 + 1 = 2, or 1 + 1 can equal 0, or 1 + 1 can equal 1.5, or 1 + 1 can equal 10, you know? So I know that sounds confusing, but I'll give you a couple examples. So cumulative effect, if you have, let's say if you have a herb like soy and the active compounds in it is genistein. So genistein is from soy. Red clover also has genistein. So if you had soy in your diet and you took a red clover extract, because it's the same substance in both, you're not suddenly going to have, it's just like you've almost doubled up on one of them. So, and because these dose response curves start to plateau, you're not going to get to 100%, you know, in this case, 25 + 25 doesn't necessarily equal 50, but it could. So you have a cumulative effect where it kind of gets a stacked effect. So another example of this is if you're making a tincture up and you took a herb like barberry and combined it with Oregon grape, because the active ingredient in both is berberine, a compound called berberine, you're going to have more of like the similar effects as if you just doubled the dose of one of them in a lot of ways, in my opinion. So you're not going to get a synergistic effect. It's going to be more of a stacked effect. okay? So that's the cumulative effect. A plus B equals kind of the effects of basically doubling A or doubling B. An antagonistic effect is if you take substance C and you combine it with substance D, so this would be like estrogen when combined with tamoxifen, the outcome here is that substance D blocks the effects of substance C. So that's an antagonistic effect, okay? So it neutralizes the effects of one of them, okay? And that's an antagonistic effect. A modulating effect is if you take estrogen and you combine it with phytoestrogens, so it's a high dose of substance C and you add it with substance E, it brings down the overall effect of substance C would be alone. And so on the left, this would be an example of how substance C and E combined would look like in, let's say, a woman who is hyperestrogenic or has really high estrogen levels during reproductive years, okay? Maybe she's got severe menstrual cramps because her estrogen levels are too high for whatever reason. You combine a phytoestrogen in there, it lowers the estrogen levels to help to normalize it. And this diagram on the right here, where you have low amounts of substance C, when you combine it with the same amount of whatever that phytoestrogen is, the outcome is that it actually increases the overall effect. So it kind of helps to buffer. That's what these phytoestrogens or these partial agonists do, is they buffer it. So if it's too high, it brings it down. Too low, it brings it up. And partial agonists in general are really safe because you can give 10 cups of chamomile tea and nobody's going to overdose. Like, you're not going to cause a lot of harm with that. Compare that to taking 10 pills of some kind of barbiturate, you will overdose and die. So the nice thing is even if you don't really know what you're doing with herbal medicine, most of the herbs that we use are pretty safe. So the likelihood of you causing harm prescribing herbs is a lot less than the harm you could prescribe, the harm you could cause prescribing drugs or giving a lot of drugs. So natural things are a lot more forgiving, which is kind of nice. So I don't really get overly paranoid. Obviously, there's exceptions. There are certain herbs that you eat one flower will kill you, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Okay. So the modulating effects of phytoestrogens. Where to use phytoestrogens in practice? Menstrual issues, hot flashes, breast cancer prevention. Because you've got estrogen receptors in your bones, it can also help improve osteoporosis. Men, it may help with BPH because they can modulate testosterone receptors to some degree. My opinion, in general, eating more phytoestrogens in your diet is, especially when you're older, because steroids usually encourage the growth of things and stimulate the growth of things. And so when you're older, in your 60s and 70s and 80s, stimulating growth is not necessarily a good thing because that's usually associated with cancer. So phytoestrogens often help prevent heart disease and also help prevent different types of cancers through whatever the mechanisms are. So they're good. So flax on the left, this is a phytoestrogen found in flax. It's called enterolactone. And in soy and also in red clover, genistein is what's showed there. You can see those OH groups, they both have them, and they can orientate themselves in three-dimensional space and have the desired effect. Neither one of these is overly stimulating on breast tissue, and it seems to may have some beneficial effect on binding to estrogen receptors in bone. So it may help with osteoporosis and also lower the risk of breast cancer. Certainly flax lowers the risk for breast cancer, maybe even more than soy does. So I'm a big fan of soy. I think soy is good if people tolerate it, as long as it's not GMO and has some other issues. And if you don't believe me, then look at populations around the world that consume soy. There are 5 blue zones. Blue zones are areas in the world where people live over 100, and it was basically a guy from National Geographic went and interviewed people in these areas and looked at common trends between these diets and everything else. 2 of the blue zones in the diet, one in Japan and one in California, eat a fair amount of soy. And so, a test tube study might show that soy slightly increases cancer growth in a test tube, but appreciate when you're doing a test tube study, you've got a estrogen positive cancer cell and you subject it to soy, it will stimulate the growth a little bit. But in the human body, it will actually protect it from more dangerous estrogen levels. So that's one of the reasons why there's some controversy over why soy causes breast cancer. In a test tube, yes, it'll make it grow. In the human body, it'll actually protect it. If you don't believe me, go and look at the studies. Just look at the research. Here's a study on flax. It basically showed that it lowers the risk of breast cancer by 18%, improved mental health by 24%, and overall mortality, which is death, by 31%. So I eat flax every day and recommend it to every single patient. Flax is awesome. There's another study on flax for prostate issues. Another one, in general, if you're eating a plant-based diet with nuts and seeds and legumes, you're eating phytoestrogens, and that's going to be the healthiest type of diet for people for sure. Here's soy intake may protect against the adverse effects of bisphenol A. So I'm trying to give you some science to back up. It's not my opinion that soy is safe, but I think it's safe, assuming you don't have an allergy and you don't have a sensitivity. Certainly, I know lots of people, if they eat tofu, it makes them fart and feel bloated. So if you don't feel good eating it, then don't eat it. But otherwise, for lots of people, there's no harm in doing that. Now, another thing I want to show you is combining things in a synergistic ways. So here, substance A, when combined with substance F, will actually have an effect that's even greater than one of them alone. And not just twice as, it's not like a cumulative effect where it's 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 + 1 = 10. And to give you an example of this is, remember when we were talking about ayahuasca? It's a fun little example. So there's some ayahuasca being, let me go back. So ayahuasca and the Amazon, it's actually the combination of two plants. So the woody part here is the ayahuasca vine, and then chacruna is the leaf at the bottom of this pot here. And so in the Amazon, they basically brew this up, and they have their own little recipes to it. Sometimes they'll throw some other herbs into it. And if you were to take either of these plants alone, it wouldn't have a significant effect. But when you take them both together, it has a profound effect, causing really strong hallucinations. And what's interesting about it is chacruna, that little plant there, which is kind of a pretty little plant, this contains a compound called dimethyltryptophan. And dimethyltryptophan is normally released from people's brains when they have a near-death experience. So, yes, it's found in the plant, but we make this in our bodies as well, which is kind of interesting. But what happens is when you take dimethyltryptophan orally, and this happens with a lot of dietary compounds that have a nitrogen in it, including serotonin, melatonin, epinephrine, dimethyltryptophan, pyramine, which is found in a lot of fermented foods. In your gut, you have an enzyme called monoamine oxidase that will inhibit these things so they don't have neurological effects. Otherwise, every time you had some fermented cheese and wine, you'd end up having basically increased heart rate and blood pressure and headaches, and could end up dying from it. And in the case of other things, you might be eating foods and hallucinating or whatever may happen. So our body wants to inhibit compounds that affect the nervous system. So the dimethyltryptophan in the chacruna basically doesn't have any effect on us when you take it in orally. Now, if you snort it or inject it or smoke it, it will, but not if you take it orally, okay? However, the ayahuasca vine, which by itself has little effects on the nervous system directly, but indirectly what this does is it contains a compound called harmaline, and the harmaline blocks the monoamine oxidase enzyme and then allows for this dimethyltryptophan to be absorbed into your bloodstream and get into the central nervous system and cause these potent hallucinations and everything else. So here's an example of when you combine two plants, it produces effects that neither one of them can do on their own. And that's kind of cool, I think. Another example of this is compounds found in Oregon grape and barberry. Now, both of these plants contain berberine. So berberine is an antimicrobial, so it's an antifungal, antibacterial, antiviral, antiparasitic compound that basically the way that it works, it inhibits an enzyme involved with cleaving off proteins when it's being made in the RNA. So there's an enzyme called sortase that it basically blocks that enzyme so that proteins can't get made. The problem is that berberine alone, you have to give it a really high amounts for it to be effective. And the reason for that, berberine, which is the drug, so to speak, from the plant, it migrates into the plants. It's negatively charged on the inside, so these positive charged ions migrate into the plant. But then what happens is these proton pumps, or sorry, these multi-drug resistant pumps that are a lot of microorganisms have, actively pumps out the berberine so that it can never reach a level that becomes toxic in the plant. So what that means is you got to take high amounts of berberine in order for it to be effective, because these multi-drug resistant pumps are pumping these things out. And when it comes to chloroquine, remember that anti-malaria we talked about, there's a lot of disease resistance to chloroquine. Chloroquine resistance is because of these multi-drug resistant pumps. So when people take it, it's just the parasites just actively pump it out. So berberine and chloroquine are examples of natural products that, when given in high amounts alone, it really isn't that effective for treating bugs. And if you get too high, some of these can become, too toxic to be effective. Now, what's interesting is inside barberry, the herb, or Oregon grape has it as well, is the individual herb doesn't contain just berberine, but it also contains another compound, which is what's called a flavonolignin, and the abbreviation for it is 5-MHC. And this 5-MHC compound possesses no antibiotic properties or antimicrobial properties alone. But what it does, so it has no effect when given in isolation. But when you combine it with the berberine, what it does, it's responsible for blocking this multi-drug resistant pump. And as a result, the berberine, which is the antibiotic or antimicrobial in this case, remains elevated inside the cell of the microorganism. So what that means is, when you combine the berberine with the 5-MHC, you only need a small amount of the berberine, relatively speaking, for it to be effective. So the summary is, berberine alone, it'll work, but you got to take super high amounts that may not even be attainable through oral transmission. And if you were to inject it, it might be toxic. The berberine alone really won't work that well. The 5-MHC, the flavonolignin, won't work that well alone. But when you combine them, the berberine stays inside that cell, because basically they work synergistically. You only have to use a small amount to have the therapeutic effect. I think this is really cool stuff. And in my opinion, this is where the research needs to go for antibiotic resistance, anti-parasitic resistance. It's like, maybe chloroquine will still work if we can develop, or maybe even just boro. I bet you 5-MHC is some kind of multi-drug resistant pump inhibitor. I bet you exists in chinchonum bark. I don't know, but I'd love if someone could do a research study and do a comparison to find out, is the tea still effective against malaria, more effective than just giving quinine alone? Okay? If you want to, this is one of the studies. There's been other studies since, but this is one of the first studies that was done with it. And I just made nicer pictures. This is the picture from the trial, but I think my pictures with this little rendition of a bacteria that I made up looks prettier. That was back when I didn't have a wife and I think children. I had lots of time to make my lectures look pretty. So, boom, 11:50, finished right on time. I can't believe it. Okay, so we finished the introduction lecture. I'm really happy I got that done. Did not go over. Jessica has a question. Any more questions? Flaxseed or flax oil, are they equivalent? So when you're looking at flaxseed is unrefined, so you have to grind it. So to give you an idea, if you just eat flax seeds, it won't do anything. So you do have to process it to some degree. So the way that I process it, I throw it in a coffee grinder and grind it up. So that's the simplest processing, where I'm basically physically breaking up the seed, so it'll liberate the active ingredients inside. So when I do that, so ground flaxseed, you'll have fiber, which is water soluble. You'll have the lignins, what are relatively water soluble, but not very soluble in fat. And then you have the fixed oil, which is what contains the omega-3s and a little bit of omega-6s in it. So whole flax will have the polyphenolic compounds called lignans in it. Ground flax does. Flaxseed oil will have the omega-3 fatty acids, the omega-6 fatty acids, maybe some other compounds, but very, very little of the actual phytoestrogens in it, because the phytoestrogens aren't very soluble in fat. There'll probably be some, but there's not a lot. So the best way to get them is going to be grinding up a flaxseed and eating it. And again, if you want the omega-3s, a tablespoon of flaxseed oil will have a lot more omega-3 fatty acids in it than a tablespoon of the ground flax does. But if you want the fiber and the lignans, because the fiber is good bulk laxative, good for constipation, and the polyphenol compounds like the lignans are great antioxidants, help with prostate cancer, breast cancer, heart disease, diabetes. There's all that stuff. You're better off eating the ground seeds. There'll still be the omega-3s in it, but much smaller amounts. Okay. Do you guys have any other questions? How was the lecture today? Can you guys give me some feedback? Did you like it? Is it okay? Too much information? Anyone still out there? Somebody liked it. Thanks, Tara. So moving forward, the next 3 lectures is going to be all phytochemical stuff. And I think it'll be enjoyable. It's a bit heavy, but don't worry. I'm going to go through and give you some practice exam questions. So if you're feeling any level of anxiety about it, you don't need to know the dates for the history stuff. I don't really care about the history stuff that much, but I have to give you some exam questions. It'll be questions like, just so you're aware, you can think about it right now. I might say, what system of medicine developed the 4 humors? Phlegm, yellow bowel, black bowel, or blood? Was it Ayurvedic medicine or TCM? Or I might say, which of the following people compiled a book called the Materia Medica? Was it Dioscorides? Was it Hippocrates? Was it Avicenna? Okay. And I might ask, flaxseed contains phytoestrogens that are A, an agonist, B, antagonist, C, partial agonist, or D, something else. Which of the following statements is true? Flax, A, causes cancer. I don't know, something like that. An example of synergy, I gave 2 examples of synergy combining 5-HTC, 5-HC and berberine. With regards to these guys, I might say, which of the following drugs are naturally occurring and historically used to treat heart disease? Is it A, digoxin, B, aspirin? Okay. So we'll go through more of these exam type of questions later on. I'll give you a list of them. If you guys don't have any other questions, I'll sign it off. If you want, well, if you miss some of this, chances are you're not listening to it now, but I will try to post all the lectures by Wednesday if I can. And if for some reason they don't record, I do have backups from previous years I can always post. Okay? So you guys have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week. Okay? Bye for now.